Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by Stephen Talbot, BJ Costello, Len Tantillo, and Tom Ruller for our program, Mapping the Erie Canal, Yesterday and Today. 4 experts in 4 realms of New York's exquisite and enduring canal system. Stephen Talbot was educated as an architect at Carnegie Mellon University and built the first computer maps of New York City starting in 1982. Since then, he's been involved with software development and marketing, startups, nanotechnology, street lighting consulting, and analytic website building. He has recently returned to his map-making roots with geographic information systems, first for work and now out of curiosity. Last fall, he was awarded a Hackman Research Residency by the New York State Archives Partnership Trust. Stephen lives in Albany County, very close to all the versions of the Erie and Champlain canals. Bartley B.J. Costello serves as chair of the Albany Waterway, Incorporated, a New York not-for-profit corporation whose mission is to educate the public about the potential of creating a new waterway to bring the Hudson River to Albany, revitalizing the downtown area and creating an economic transformation for the capital region. Mr. Costello is a senior counsel at the Albany law firm of Hinman Straub PC, where he has specialized in complex litigation, government affairs, and public employment law for over 50 years. He has been a resident of Albany since arriving there in 1969 after serving two tours on the demilitarized zone in Vietnam as a naval officer. He is a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross and Albany Law School. He deeply believes in Albany, having formed the Pine Hills Neighborhood Association, the Neighborhood Resource Center, and the Council of Albany Neighborhood Associations. He chairs the board of the Government Law Center at Albany Law School and the Destroyer Escort Historical Museum, the USS Slater. BJ is also a steward of the Archives Partnership Trust and a fellow of the New York Bar Foundation. Len Tantillo is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. Mr. Tantillo is a licensed architect who left the field of architecture in 1986 to pursue a career in the fine art of historical and marine painting. Since that time, his work has appeared internationally in exhibitions, publications, and film documentaries. He is the author of 4 books and the recipient of 2 honorary degrees. He is a fellow of the American Society of Marine Artists, the New York chapter of the Holland Society, and the New York Academy of History. His work is included in the collections of the Fenimore Art Museum, the Minnesota Museum of Marine Art, the Albany Institute of History and Art, the Noble Maritime Collection at Sailors Snug Harbor, numerous historical societies, and corporate and private collections in the USA and abroad. In 2004, he was commissioned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art to create a painting depicting the Daniel Winnie House as it may have appeared in 1755. Thomas J. Ruller recently retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he has held since 2015. Here, Tom oversaw care and access to over 5,000 cubic feet of canal records, including thousands of maps of New York's canal system. An active professional for 35 years, he is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. So those of you who have joined us today, thank you, welcome. There will be a question and answer session at the end of this presentation, so please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll set aside a few minutes at the end to get to as many of those questions as we can, and I'm sure you will have some. In the meantime, I am pleased to introduce Stephen Talbot, BJ Costello, Len Tantillo, and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie, Stephen, Len, BJ. It's great to be here with you and to talk about the Erie Canal. And well, all of New York's canals, they're the gift that keeps on giving. And I think we learned so much from the history of New York's efforts to build these tremendous public works projects, but they also give us an opportunity to touch back to the past and understand how our environment across this state has changed and evolved over time. As archivists, we preserve records and documents, and as Josie just said, a lot of material related to New York's canal system, the Erie Canal especially, but the other canals that have been constructed across this state. They're tremendously valuable resources, but they're only valuable when people use them. They're only valuable when people interpret them and connect them to their world and their communities. And that's what you're doing. And I'm so excited about this program today because it helps these documents that we preserve come to life and helps people who may not understand what has happened here before connect to the past and understand, in many cases, what's under their feet. I think the best place to start this conversation is with Stephen, who has done a tremendous amount of work using some of the myriad maps that we preserve in the state archives and have digitized many of them and have connected those maps that are often hundreds of years old to maps that are older than them, older than those hundreds of year old maps, to modern maps and modern photographs in the modern environment. So, Stephen, can I turn the program over to you? I know you've got a PowerPoint, so I'm going to stop talking and let you talk us through the research and the work that you've done, particularly related to the Albany Basin.
All righty. All right, Tom, thank you very much. As Tom mentioned, I've been working with the Erie Canal maps for about 2-3 years now, in terms of putting them together from the original resources. And like Tom said, there's thousands of these maps and they're all woven together into sort of a nice mosaic that really sort of gives you a feel for how the Erie Canal existed at different periods of time. So I've been using these historic map resources, the New York State Archives, to basically build an entire digital map of the Erie Canal. So let's just start with one map. This is the Albany Fort Orange map that was done by John Wolfgang Romer in 1698. And it's the earliest survey of Fort Orange. And if you look at it, there's, some nice little features here. There's the old Dutch fort, which is actually Fort Orange. You can see the Hudson River. There's the East Gate. And then there's the road to Ye Half Moon and Ye Saratoga, which I always enjoy, as well as Schenectady Gate and the North Gate. This is interesting in and of itself, but in terms of lacking the modern context, it's a little hard to say exactly where this is and where these features were and other things like that. And what I did just very quickly was put this onto a modern map to give us a feel for where Albany started. And this is one of the earliest surveys of Albany, and you get a much better feel for where things are. And now we can sort of see, there's the state capitol just on the edge of the map, the State Museum and Archives, where all these wonderful records are, is just off to the left. And, the North Gate is right there by Albany City Hall, and you can see the Broadway and D&H building, as well as where the old Dutch fort is. It gives you a much better context for how to sort of understand how, this fabric of history was basically laid down. And you can also see that the waterfront was right there, and Albany's always been a waterfront city. We have 787 cutting across it right now, kind of disconnecting things, but you can get a feel for how the waterfront was always there from the beginning of the founding of Fort Orange. Well, what we can do is we can start to look at these things and say, oh, let's weave this together, and how does this all fit together? So the Erie Canal, as I think most people know, is connected to Albany to the west and also through the Champlain right up to Canada. And again, when you look at an old record of the Erie Canal in 1825, you get the profile and you can kind of get the map, but it's a little hard to say where this is exactly in terms of our modern understanding of geography. So there's Buffalo, there's Albany, and there's the Champlain Canal reaching up through Lake Champlain all the way to the border of Canada. So by putting these maps together, you can zoom all the way out and see it at the state level, or you can zoom right in and start to understand all of the workings and pieces that made the canal come together. So one thing I didn't understand before starting this, we have a modern context. We think in terms of engineers doing plans and surveys and putting everything together before you start construction. Well, back then, they kind of didn't have that level of sophistication in terms of engineering. They sent surveyors out to basically reconnoiter the route, find the route, and sort of figure out where it's going, but they didn't put together detailed drawings of the canal before they started. And, it's really pretty amazing that, they sort of bushwhacked their way through, these trails and everything and sort of said, this is the best route and this is the route that we're kind of going to follow. But then they sent out parties with, old transits and levels and other things and chains and basically said, this is how we're going to basically do the route on the fly as they did it. And remarkably, they did it and often, met precisely in the middle for different surveyors and different contractors. So this is the Champlain Canal. North is this way. Here's the modern map with the locks laid out. And here is the James Geddes map from 1820, when they were just starting out in terms of building the canal. And here we have a cross section and you can kind of see how things go up to a level and then go down to Whitehall up here. And, it's really sort of amazing how much they were able to get done before engineering schools really existed and how precise they were in terms of building these canals and, getting them through the state. So there are three major historic maps that I've been working with from the archives. And they are the Hutchinson maps that were done just after the completion of the canal, and it was done by Holmes Hutchinson, the surveyor. And it's a complete guide to the enlargement. It was used to basically serve as a guide for the enlargement of the Clinton Ditch Erie Canal, the first version of the canal. And these are exquisite drawings, and they're beautiful, and they're all actually online in terms of a digital archives on the archive site. There are the Schillner maps, which were done a little bit later. And these are exquisite drawings as well. They are actually very large. And they are, I forget how big, but they cover that entire table. So, something like 5 feet by 7 feet. And it was done in 1895 to plan the improvements of the canal to deepen it from 7 feet to 9 feet. And that never actually happened. The barge canal came later. And then there's the blue line maps. And these are actually maps that were done of the canals to do a survey used to dispose of the property after the barge canal construction was completed. So they are very, very nice set of resources about the last version of the canal. And they were all done as an accurate survey with modern surveying techniques that really are, an engineering level of work in terms of the survey and the drawings and everything else. And, these are really exquisite resources. You can see the artistry of the maps as well as the technology of the maps. And you can see how the technology basically progresses from 1834 to 1910 across these map sets. So here's the challenge. These are the Hutchinson maps for the Albany Basin area. Here's the Albany Basin where the canal started, and here's some pieces. And these maps are all here. They're a little hard to interpret when you look at them. You can see some stuff, there are a few streets and other things, but there's not a lot of context in terms of how these maps go together. And you got to really sort of have a sort of a brilliant imagination to understand how these fit and make them very difficult to really know where exactly all these features are across these maps. So these maps are all across the, from the Albany Basin down here, all the way up for people in the Albany area, up through Waterville. So the process to do this is really to sort of take data from modern sources, a modern map, taking GPS and lots of math magic to put these things together. So if you look at the modern map, you can see two intersections that correspond to two intersections on the Hutchinson map. And then you can start to register these things. And there's also a number of other resources that people have gone out there and actually gotten GPS points for things. And what this starts to do is let you build this mosaic. So what you can do is basically say these 2 points here are on the geography in terms of the modern map. This point connects to this point, and that point connects to this point, and we have this GPS point up here. And what that allows you to do is put these maps together and span from known point to known point to build an integrated map. And here we have what they look like when they are assembled, And, you know, there's this little funny steps, you know, of maps, and, you know, they're pieces of maps and you put them together, but you start to see how the canal can actually stretch from point A to point B across the geography. Then what you can do is lay them on a modern map. And again, they start to fit together, and you start to look for other evidence that's out there in terms of streets, in terms of ruins, in terms of all these different points to essentially assemble the map onto the modern geography. And when you put it together, you can start to relate lots and lots of different pieces of maps together. So here's the enlarged, this is in the Cohoes area. So here's the enlarged Erie Canal, here's the Champlain Canal, and here's the Clinton Ditch Canal. So there are 3 generations of canal on one map. And again, what we can start to do is start to understand where these things are and how they go together. So the Schillner maps are a wonderful resource, and what's really unique about these Schillner maps is that they're more modern with more landscapes, but they also have a very important bridge between the 1834 maps and the enlarged canal. So if you look very carefully in here, this little bit of shadow that's drawn here is the original basin of the Erie Canal from the Schillner maps. And there are these traces that show up all through there. So again, it provides a very nice bridge between a resource that was done in 1834 and one that's done, you know, I guess almost 7 or just about 70 years later. And what that does is it really starts to give you a much better way of starting to relate these resources together. And these, you know, are done to pretty modern standards and are exquisitely drawn. And what's really good news is that there's a restoration project that's underway that's actually rescanning these things into a very accurate resource that will be of great use through the mapping of the canal and building these resources. And then there's the blue line maps. And again, this is an accurate certified survey with common geography to aerials and current maps. And they also fit with a great deal of mathematical fit. And that's really important because that says you're fitting them right and putting them together right. And the strategy has been to build large sections of map to get the best number of on-the-ground points for fitting. So here we have the Albany Basin. Here's the big strip of the maps put together. So this is about 4 of them strung together. And here's how it actually fits on the modern geography. So here we have, you know, this is Ferry Street right here. Here's Water Street. Here's 787. And you can start to see how all these pieces start to fit together. Plus, you get a lot of historical context. You get, you know, land ownership. You get some building outlines. You get a lot of information that you can just start to read off of the map and really start to put together into, you know, this wonderful mosaic of history across the state. So what this enables you to do now is start to integrate other resources, because we have a base map, and those base maps can then be related to other records that are out there that aren't necessarily, you know, full maps of the canal. So here we have the basin for Albany. Here's where Lock 1 is. Here's where the basin is that we were just looking at. And here is Lock 1 on a survey that was done in the 1860s to do maintenance on the Albany Basin. So here's the basin, here's Lock 1, here's a view of the basin. You can sort of see the opening here, and here's the opening right there, and there's Maiden Lane. And all of a sudden, you know, we have these Sanborn maps that have, again, another level of detail that tells you what's really going on in terms of the waterfront and the businesses that are on the waterfront. You can see that, you know, from the 1892 region, there's a whole sort of set of railroad tracks that go through here, and you can still see that the basin's active with a lot of structures and other things. So it provides an incredible layer of information about what was going on at the different eras across the canal. And what this really lets us do is integrate these resources and really put them together. So here we have the Albany Basin from 1834. Here's Ferry Street. Here's Ferry Street on the blue line maps from the 1910s, 1920s. Here are structure diagrams or structure drawings of the actual structure that's on Ferry Street from 1887. And these are, again, are all archival records. And then we have this other wonderful resource, which is the history of the canal system put together by Noble Whitford. And in there is a very complete inventory of all the structures that are on the canal. So here we have a record of the Ferry Street Bridge. Here we have information about the bridge in terms of its width, its span, you know, how many walkways there were, all sorts of information. And then we can tie this record directly to its location here. And then we can start to relate all of these documents that are in the archives to it. And here's a picture of the lift bridge looking east. And note the staircase on one side, and we have the staircase drawing here, and it all fits together. And, you know, it's a way of integrating not just the maps, but any number of documents that are related to location of things that are on the canal. And, you know, one of the interesting things about the canal in New York State and Albany, you can't step anywhere without being close to information about the canal or history in the region. And that's what's really remarkable and nice about, you know, doing this kind of work and putting these things together. So, sneak peek, there's a publication that's being worked on for the 200th anniversary of the canal. It's opening. It's going to be for the New York State Canal Society meeting in October. And what we're doing is, again, integrating information. Here we have the map. Here are some, you know, bird's eye view of, you know, of these towns along the map. And again, here is that Whitford inventory, and here's how it directly relates to the different pieces of, you know, things along the Champlain Canal. So here's the junction, here's the old junction with the original Erie Canal, the Clinton Ditch. Here's how the Champlain Canal progresses through Cohoes. Here's how it crosses the Mohawk River into Waterford. And then what we have are extracts of the Schillner maps and, you know, where they relate to. And this is being put together in a publication that will be available at the Canal Society meeting coming up. So what's really important about this? It's a way of integrating our resources, our historical resources, all these documents that Tom talked about that are in the archives, and how do we put them together? And this is what really helps us understand our historical, you know, historical heritage in context. So here we have, you know, the map from, you know, the original survey of Fort Orange. Here we have the Albany Basin. Here's the 1698 waterfront. Here's the Basin waterfront. It's not that different. You know, it progressed out a little bit, and, you know, they built a little bit of fill and other things, probably wanted more land for warehouses and other things like that. So here's the basin. Here's the, you know, end of the Erie Canal. Here's the enlarged Erie Canal. And this is where the Ferry Street Bridge was that, you know, had all those documents that were interrelated and put together. It's really a way of putting together context so we can understand what was there and, you know, where we, you know, where you could go, you know, with these canals and resources. And it really gives you an understanding of how they operated the canal as well. This is the lumber district. Here's the piers for the lumber district up here. And here's how we can sort of, you know, start to understand the bits and pieces, the bridges, the basins, the locks. And, you know, it's not just a ditch. It's a working infrastructure, and this really gives us a feel for how that infrastructure operated in different periods of time and who was on the canal and how people interrelated to the canal. And you can tie all sorts of historical resources from newspaper articles to all sorts of other things and start to understand the geographic context of these things. And, you know, when you're there and standing in these places, you don't necessarily get a good view, but with these kinds of maps, you really can start to understand how the canal was there and what was there, and start to understand how it really interrelated to, you know, our existence over periods of time. So let me conclude and say, let me toss it off, I guess, to BJ.
I'm blown away by what just happened. So, Tom, did you want to say something?
I guess I wanted to just clarify. I think one of the things that right now, today, when we talk about Lock 1, many of us talk about the Federal Lock, which is just outside of Troy. The Lock 1 that you talked about was here in Albany. It was lock number 1 of the original canal. The terminus, the basin really was the eastern terminus of the Erie Canal, which is where all those boats either started from or arrived at to transfer their goods onto the boats going to New York City. But Lock 1 is not the Federal Lock. Lock 1 is really some structure that is now within the city of Albany. I think Len and BJ are going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's the connection between what we think we know and what actually is the truth about where this Lock 1 really was. So that was all I was going to talk about or ask about. So I'm going to turn it over to you, BJ.
Thank you, Tom. You know, what's very clear listening to Stephen and will also be from Lynn is Albany sits on the Hudson River, one of the most important rivers in the world. And yet, if you walk around the city of Albany, some people wouldn't even know the Hudson River was there. The connection that Stephen showed to the river from those older maps does not exist today. And Lock 1 that Tom just mentioned is up near the modern press building, near the central warehouse, if you want to just situate it, buried. And one of our missions is to open that up. I'm part of something called the Albany Waterway, Inc., which is a not-for-profit, as was mentioned. And what we have seen is the power of water across the state. I ride the Erie Canal from Buffalo to Albany. I've seen all these cities and towns that have been completely re-energized by water. And it's good for the residents, it's good for tourists, it's good for the economy, it's good for the environment. And we got inspired because I met Lynn Tantillo, who had a brilliant idea that he's going to talk about in a minute, of rather than bringing Albany to the water, bring the water into Albany. And when he talks about it, you'll see where it connects back up with what Stephen was talking about. We've had a lot of people say, well, this is an impossible thing to do. I always think of President Kennedy, who said, we're going to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And we're going to win because we're going to put our energies and best efforts behind it. Our inspiration really is over 200 years ago when the Erie Canal was built, and it traversed 363 miles. It was 40 feet wide. It was 4 feet deep. It was dug by immigrants with rudimentary tools. And these visionaries managed to overcome many obstacles, including funding, losing 100 workers to malaria in the Montezuma Swamp, and the challenges of Lockport. And Lockport, as they were working along, they started going east from Rome and west from Rome. When they got to Lockport, they ran into the Niagara Escarpment, which is 70 feet of rock straight up. So they're going from a swamp and farms to a rock. Well, what did they do? They figured it out, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. And what did they do? The engineers figured out how to put in 5 locks to get up over that escarpment. The only issue was when they got up over that 70 feet, they realized the Niagara River was 60 feet. So now they had to go down 10 feet. And what did they do? They dug through this hard rock for a number of miles over 3 years, losing people, dynamiting and picks and shovels, again, rudimentary tools, and ultimately they succeeded and got into Buffalo. And what did that basically do? In 9 years, the state recouped their investment from tolls from boats. So people say, how much will your waterway in Albany cost? And I always say, well, you know what? We know because we've looked at other cities, we know there's going to be recouped. And as a result of the Erie Canal, Syracuse didn't even exist before the Erie Canal. Buffalo became a major city. Albany became a major city. New York State became the Empire State. New York City became the center of commercial activity in the United States. And by the end of the 20th century, Buffalo was the 8th largest city in America. That's the power of water. You know, our benefit here as we look at this is that this will spur economic development in Albany. Albany at the moment, downtown Albany is a pretty quiet place. Between the pandemic and people working remotely and people moving out of the city, it's become somewhat of a ghost town a lot of times. Our waterway will spur economic development. It'll attract public and private development for shops, bars, restaurants, boutiques, businesses. It'll help out with the environmental issues because we know that we've got rising rivers. It'll also increase regional and out-of-state tourism. You know, I'm in charge of the Slater in the Port of Albany. People come from all over, 20,000 people a year, the biggest attraction in Albany. They go, where can we walk to get a cup of coffee? The answer is nowhere. This waterway will bring those people in. It will also benefit residents of the city by bringing the water into them, which today they do not have access to. It'll improve the ambience. People can enjoy it. Great. Why do we know this is feasible? Because we've studied San Antonio. We've studied Providence. If you've been to any of these places, you'll see it. Providence used to be a city way down on its luck. Despite the fact that Lynn Tantillo studied there, it was still down on its luck. And they put in, they opened up the river, and they've become a totally recharged city, a jewel on the eastern coast. We looked at Canal Side in Buffalo, which was an old industrial area. And when you look at that today and see the benefits that come into Buffalo from Canal Side, that's where the canal ended, the opposite of our Lock 1 on this end. And you can see that the cost of the construction pales in comparison to the amount of money that comes in. So why are we doing this now? We're doing this now because of really three things. One, the current condition of Albany downtown, which lacks any economic activity really, despite being the capital city of the Empire State. It's the 200th anniversary of the completion of the Erie Canal, which is really important. And the third part is Pat Fahey, a local assemblywoman, has obtained a state grant of over $5 million. And that $5 million is being used by the Department of Transportation to look at a number of projects, including this particular project, all dealing with the Albany downtown and the waterfront. So we believe that, that this is going to result in increased taxes to the city. It's going to just change the whole dynamic of downtown Albany. And I think with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lynn to actually explain what his vision is. So Lynn, you want to do that?
Sure, BJ. I'm gonna share my screen. And we're going to go through some slides. So hopefully everyone can see this. It's really interesting that Stephen showed so many of those maps. And those maps have been such a great inspiration to him and his work. And I'm fascinated by maps as well. This is one of the early maps of Albany. This map was made by the Dutch around 1634. It has many details, including locating Fort Orange and some of the farms around the fort. I used this map and worked with a number of historians and archaeologists, starting, I think maybe more than 20 years ago, to create a series of paintings. This is the most recent painting that I made of Fort Orange. You can see the activity around it, and you can see the beginnings of a community that becomes Beverwyck. This is a map that we were looking at earlier. This is the Wolfgang Romer map that Stephen showed. This map was drawn around 1695. There's a lot of information on this map, and I think the interesting thing that was shown in Stephen's presentation was how accurate this map is. You can take this map and lay it on the streets of Albany today, and it aligns perfectly. This is a pen and ink drawing I made based on that map. You can see the stockade. Fort Orange is not in this picture. It's a little bit off out of the frame here. This is the English fort at the top of the hill. This is State Street and what becomes Broadway down here. This is a great map of Albany. This is a map that was drawn in the 1750s. The city is really starting to develop. Again, this map is loaded with details. And again, I use this map for a reference for this painting, which is in the collection of the Albany Institute of History and Art. And I might note that this painting is now on exhibit at the Albany Institute of History and Art in an amazing exhibition of 113 different artists work in the field of marine art. This again, a map of Albany, this time in the late 1700s. This map and other materials were used to create this painting. This is the largest painting I ever made. It's about 10 feet long in its frame, and we're looking along the shore of the Hudson River. We're looking north toward Troy. The tallest mountain in the background is Bald Mountain. And again, this time the Albany Basin. This map was drawn around the mid to late 1850s. And this is the painting that I made of the Albany Basin. Again, Stephen spoke about this in his presentation. So when I show all these maps, people are probably wondering why? Why am I showing you all these maps and all the paintings that I've made of Albany at that time? And the reason why these maps are interesting is because of that arc of shoreline, that incredible arc of shoreline. At one time, the Hudson River was much, much wider than it is today. It's been filled in over time. But at one time, the Hudson River came way into the city, almost to Broadway. I've been looking at those and thinking about those, and I started wondering, when you start, I started collecting these presentations that were made to improve the city. I started collecting them in the 1960s. I have about a dozen of them. And they have, there were various plans put forth. Some of them were implemented, some of them were not. Many of them were modest, that just kind of accommodated things like landscaping, benches, trees, planting beds. And others, like the one in the middle on the bottom there, was a much more ambitious plan that was really designed to build a completely new Albany out at the riverfront on the top of a huge platform. That project never went anywhere. But I kept thinking, all these efforts, especially the major efforts, were designed to try to push the city further east so that it would align with the river again. And I wondered what would happen if you tried to bring the river back into the city where it once was. So that's what became the impetus for the idea of a canal in Albany, and that occurred 27 years ago in the 1990s. There have been a number of projects that have occurred since then. This is Canalside in Buffalo, major restoration of the waterfront. This is the Bricktown Canal in Oklahoma City, where there was no water once. Now there is a feature in this community that has become a major attraction. This is Providence, Rhode Island, the Riverwalk. I went to school in Rhode Island. As a matter of fact, Rhode Island School of Design are these buildings that you see here in the background. When I started school in the 1960s, mid-1960s, they were filling this canal in and turning it into a parking lot. So it's very interesting to me that over the course of those 40-some years, they completely reversed their design, took their parking lots away, and opened their canal up again. The canal it's a gorgeous canal. It gets used for all kinds of events. This is probably the most well-known, the water fire event in Providence. This is the Rideau Canal in Ottawa. I love this canal because the interesting thing about it is it's so far north. It's in a much colder climate, and yet the Canadians really utilize this asset in the wintertime. This is the Rideau Canal decorated for Christmas. This is the Rideau Canal used in wintertime for all kinds of winter activities, predominantly skating. San Antonio Riverwalk, many people in the Albany area have been down there to see this. The San Antonio Riverwalk has become so popular that it has an equal amount of visitors as the Alamo. Beautiful canal, again, many activities, pedestrian activities along that stretch of waterway. And the Chicago Ship Canal, one of several canals in Chicago. This is a major waterway going through very dense metropolitan area. This is the plan that 4 of us came up with in the 1990s for the idea of bringing a canal into Albany, down Broadway, and then kind of meandering around what were at that time just swampy, unused areas, and then making its way back out into the Hudson. This is the Central Warehouse building here. This is what our group is calling option number 1. Option number 1 would totally transform the city. It would create a canal through the middle of these beautiful works of architecture. The course of the canal in this aerial view, again, would start here where there is already an underpass. This is the SUNY headquarters building here. But at this point, if vessels could access their way into the system here, the advantage is that you can pass under not only 787, but you can also pass under the railroad. When we designed this idea back in the 1990s, we had 2 criteria. One was do not disturb the highway, and the second was do not tear any buildings down. It was achievable then. Now it would take a little bit more effort because there have been construction sites that have produced buildings and parking lots that were not there before. But the idea was, again, carry it down in front of the SUNY building, down Broadway, and then make its way back out where Central Warehouse is and back out into the Hudson River. The second option was to just approach this project from the north end. So we have the Albany Basin. Stephen pointed out the area where the Erie Canal began. This is the 1840s Lock 1, the Canal Basin, the Waylock, and then the beginning of the lumber district. The original lock here in Albany was in this area, and the Canal Basin was much smaller. But by the 1850s, this is the way it looked. This is the way it looks now. And this is a catastrophically ugly building. Unfortunately, it's become iconic in terms of visitors who are entering the city from the north. This is the first view of Albany they get. And something really has to occur here, something really positive. So I made the assumption that maybe there would be a time when this building could be altered to something like this. The building itself has architectural features that could allow construction like this. The panels in this immense concrete slab and column structure, these exterior panels could be removed and made into windows or brick panels or something like that. Here I'm sort of making an assumption that this building is going to be used as apartments with possible restaurant facilities on an addition that could be built on top of the building because of the over design of the structure. So here we have that area. What we're talking about here is reintroducing water into this part of the city. Something like this is not only possible, but it was there once. This is the area where Lock 1 was located, and this is really just a recreation of the canal basin that was there in the 1840s and 1850s. What I've done is shown a possible solution for the renovation of the Central Warehouse building, but I've also provided space here for neighborhood pavilions that could be used for family reunions, gatherings of that type, and also space for commercial development, maybe even civic center for the people of the northern residential areas of the city. Marina of this type could accommodate over 150 vessels, and there's plenty of other space available for things like craft fairs, This is an eye-level view of that idea. You can see how, with some care, this building could be integrated into the architecture that already exists in Albany, and just how it might be strolling around this wonderful redesigned canal basin with food trucks and facilities there for lunches and even dinners. Option 3 is the south end, and this is the part of the project that I'm the most fascinated by. It's the area where the architecture is the most interesting. If we were to focus on this area with this beautiful work of Gothic architecture, this iconic building in New York State, if we were to put a Marina Harbor facility in front of it, we would have this incredible foreground setting for this beautiful work of architecture. As it is today, it's a really underutilized space. It's a sort of a park, I guess. When you're there and you're looking at it, I took this photograph in the middle of the week, and there was nobody there. There was hardly any traffic on Broadway. So I can only think of what would happen there if you ever implemented the idea of bringing water into the city, just there, just in front of the SUNY headquarters building. It would be an attraction like no other in upstate New York. I think it would be incredible. And a great improvement over what's there. The fourth option and final option is the idea of taking a look at the lumber district, taking a look at the canal basin and Lock 1, and there's plenty of information about the lock. Where was it? We know it's there. How do we know it's there? In 2002, two professors from Union College, Dennis Foley and Andy Wolf, stuck a shovel in the ground. They dug a hole about 2 feet deep, and they uncovered the top of Lock 1. How much of it is there? We won't know for a while. This is the last photograph that was taken of the lock before it was buried. This is the way it looked in the 1850s. So we know where it is. We know how easily it could access the water. As a project, Lock 1 could be just taken on as a park. It could be restored possibly, and just kind of utilized in that way. It would be amazing to have a historic site like that restored in the city. So in 1825, the Erie Canal was built. In 2025, we're going to be celebrating its 200th anniversary. And what better way could there be to work on the restoration of that lock? So here we have Albany today. And here we have Albany of the 18th century and that incredible arc of shoreline, what it could potentially be. We're hopeful that we can make enough people interested to actually take this project seriously and develop it into something. So I thank you for your attention, and that's the project.
This is fascinating. You're not talking about doing I hate to say it this way, doing something new. You were really reconnecting a city to its waterway. You know, the artwork that you showed, Len, the vibrancy of the activity along the waterfront, which started with the Dutch. That's how they interacted with the world, was over water. By the time the canal opened in 1825, the Albany Basin really had to be enlarged about 10 years later to accommodate the enormous amount of people and commercial traffic that flowed through Albany on its way west or on its way east. The connection to the water for the city of Albany and so many other cities across the canal and across, as you showed with your examples, across the country and across the globe, is critical to really engaging people and connecting people to what they once had. The Albany's connection to its water really spanned almost 200-300 years. And now you're trying and you're proposing through the use of maps and documents to show us where we were and where we could go back to and what we could connect to. And what, again, as an archivist, that blows my mind because it's so gratifying, because you're doing something that's only possible by taking archival resources, documents that we've preserved, and helping people see what they have, see what resources are available to them, and see how they can use those resources that exist under the ground that they're walking on to revitalize or vitalize or just change the way the world they live in is. That's why we do what we do in the archives business, and I'm glad that you all have taken advantage of those resources to help us all see a city in a very different way. I'm excited by all of this. Of course, I live in Albany, so of course I'm excited by all of this. We can't wait. Josie, I'm going to come back to you because I think we've got a few minutes available for some questions that might have come across.
Yes. So thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and exciting. But we did have a question about navigational maps from the Ocean Service. So I think this is a question for Stephen. How, or possibly for Len, how were they created? Were they created from a separate survey, or were they based on older maps? Do you know anything about these navigational maps?
I don't know anything about the particular navigational maps that are mentioned. It all depends upon the era. Typically, what they would do is set up benchmarks along the shoreline and then use those as reference points to essentially articulate what the shoreline is, what are the features in the water, do depth measurements and other things, and do a bunch of surveying work to essentially create those maps. If it's a later series or whatever, they may have already had certain references in terms of reference maps that they trusted that they could build off of. So it really depends upon the era of the map and what they were doing. If it's a really old map, they were basically sailing ships up and down and doing sightings and latitude and longitude and sketching as they went.
I did see at one time a Dutch map with depths of the river at Albany, at the Albany area. And they must have done it with weights and lines. But it's pretty fascinating because it was the area, it's the area down near the port of Albany where the Normanskill meets the Hudson River. And what I thought was incredible was the number of islands that were there that are gone. They've just the height of the river has, I think the current has washed away some of these sandbars that were there back in that time. It was much shallower, closer to shore. But that's the oldest map that I've seen with depth information on it.
Yeah, and just along those lines, the Waterfront map or the map of the Champlain Canal, basically mentions that it was navigable to Waterford and that it was a tidal river to that point. And it's still a tidal river to Troy Dam.
If I can throw an archival cover on some of this, maps up to a certain point were done by individual governments. The Dutch government or the West India Company or individual navigators would have made certain maps. We can start with the Adrian Block map, and that's where if you're doing research, you're looking at those particular sources. But after the creation of the United States government, most of those, particularly the maps that were asked about in the question, would have come from a federal agency. The feds did a lot of those maps. However, here in New York, the state owns all of the inland waterways. And so the state regulated access for landowners who abutted the state waterways. So here in the state archives, we preserve the records of permits for people to interact with the Hudson or any other body of water that the state connected. So it may not be necessarily a navigation map, but it would give you more data about the features of the particular body of water that you're interacting with. So looking at who would have made the map is a critical doorway to figuring out where am I going to find the map.
It's just so fascinating. There are so many ins and outs and so many details to how these maps were made, how they're used, and it's just so thrilling to see historical maps still being used in this way. It's exciting for those of us who enjoy archives and what they can do. So Tom, I think you have a slide with some information how people can learn more.
I certainly do, Josie. I think that's a really important thing. So for anyone who wants to learn more about the project, the Albany Waterway Canal project that Len and BJ talked about, www.albanywaterway.org. Hopefully you can all see the URL there. And then Stephen Talbot has done an enormous amount of research and has a huge number of maps of all kinds of things, including the Albany Basin. And if you go to his website, newyorkcanals.org, and you can see that I won't read out the rest of the URL, but hopefully you all can see them. You can find a lot more about the entire length of the canal, at least where Stephen has been able to connect historical maps to the modern environment. So hopefully these are great resources that you can follow up on. There's so much to learn from these maps, and there's so much detail. We could talk for 20 hours about just the Albany Basin, but think about all of the other features all up and down all of New York's canals. And these are the great ways to learn more about how one particular community here in Albany is trying to make that harness the power of water and bring the water back into the city, and learn about how that particular activity is accessible across the entire spectrum of the canal system through the work that Stephen has done. I'll leave this up for a minute or two.
Yeah. In the meantime, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you, Len, Stephen, BJ, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your work with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, you can visit nysarchivestrust.org for the Archives Partnership Trust. And the New York State Archives is at archives.nysed.gov. And I would love for you all to join us for our next online speaker series, which is entitled Fun Finds in the Archives. And that's going to take place on October 24th at 12:30. And Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that program?
I can tell you a little bit more about it. The State Archives holds 35 miles of records dating from the Dutch period to the modern day. Within that 35 miles are, as we've just discussed, beautiful maps that have an enormous amount of information. But there's a lot of activity that has occurred over the course of the colonial and state governments that produce some really interesting and very unique, and I don't want to say odd, but unexpected treasures within the collections of the State Archives. Things you wouldn't normally expect to see some government agency, whether it was a government of the British colonial empire or the Dutch government or the early state government. Things you wouldn't ordinarily expect the state to make available and have in its records. Well, they're here in the State Archives, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. It's a great doorway to understanding how government operated, what government did, and what kinds of things you might be able to expect when you do research in the historical records of New York's colony and state in the records of the State Archives.
Great. I really look forward to that. And if those of you who would like to register for that program, please head to our website, nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like to see some more of it, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov, and you can receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. So thanks again to all of our presenters today for joining us, and thanks to those of you out there who logged on to listen to this fascinating presentation. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.